Greetings, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. Greetings to all of you from Singapore. As Director of the NUS Center for International Law, it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you today to our Distinguished Speakers series. As you may know, yesterday, the United Nations General Assembly met in a rare emergency session, the first since 1982. And this was following from the failure of the Security Council to adopt a resolution that had been supported by 81 states, but vetoed only by Russia. Now, during the emergency session, member states delivered powerful message. And I was very pleased to listen to both the permanent representatives of Singapore and Turkey, who made compelling statements condemning the acts of aggression by Russia against the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, and importantly, the vital need to protect international law, the rules-based multilateral system, and principles of the UN Charter. It is against this background today that we have the great pleasure of welcoming Ambassador Gönenli. We are immensely honored to have as our distinguished speaker today, His Excellency Mehmet Burçin Gönenli, the Republic of Turkey's ambassador to Singapore. We are fortunate because he also is someone with quite a bit of experience with NATO and the Euro-Atlantic security defense, which at this critical juncture, we face perhaps one of the most serious threats to peace. As you know, Ukraine's possible NATO membership took center stage in the events leading to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, Ambassador Gönenli attended the NATO Defence College in Rome. Then between 2005 and 2009, he served at the Turkish Permanent Representation to NATO as a first secretary and then counselor. Then between 2011 and 2015, Ambassador Gönenli was once again posted to the Turkish Permanent Representation at NATO as defense counselor. He returned to the Foreign Ministry in Ankara in 2015, this time as head of department for NATO in Euro-Atlantic Security and Defense Affairs. In 2017, he was appointed as the Deputy Director General for NATO and Euro-Atlantic Security and Defense Affairs until his assignment as ambassador to Singapore in April of 2021. So it is no exaggeration to say that Ambassador Gönenli truly has extensive experience with NATO. So welcome, Ambassador. So today we're not going to have a formal lecture. Instead, I am going to ask the ambassador some questions, and then we will invite written questions and comments from the audience. There is the Q&A that you can write your questions, and we will go through those and answer them. So again, Ambassador, welcome. It is really wonderful to have you with us today. Now, if I may start with the first question I have, NATO was established in 1949 as a regional collective security organization during the Cold War, basically against threats from the former USSR. But can you explain to us the post-1991 expansion of NATO and what were its objectives once the USSR had basically disappeared from the pages of history? Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Professor Oral. It's a distinct privilege and honor for me to participate in this conversation. Thank you very much for that. Just as I begin, let me also greet Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and dear guests. I will somewhat talk in my personal capacity based on my previous experience, of course. And I just want to say that the views I express here may not necessarily represent the official views of the Turkish government. But I also would like to say one more thing, and this is perhaps more important. As just you said, we are going through a very dark period of we are going through very gloomy days in Europe and in the Euro-Atlantic area. And this war against Ukraine is, as the international community by and large acknowledges, is illegal, unjust, unprovoked. And we are trying to uphold a rules-based international order. We are trying to uphold international law. And just I was looking at the national anthem of Ukraine, and its opening lines is just as follows: Ukraine is not lost, neither its glory nor freedom. So it instills hope, and hopefully we will move towards better days. Now, with this introduction, let me expand on your question a little bit. NATO is a collective defense organization established in 1949. In the words of the first NATO Secretary General, Lord Ismay, NATO was established at that time to keep United States in, Germany down, and Soviet Union out. And it is the most successful collective defense organization, the most successful alliance in history. It is now, it has aged, but it is still agile. And its success comes from not winning wars, but from preventing crisis and preventing firing of bullets. So that's the main reason lying behind its success. NATO's main objectives is first and foremost safeguarding the independence and security of its allies by political and military means. Therefore, in a somewhat easy manner, we tend to see NATO as a purely military alliance. But in fact, it is a political military alliance. What does it do in terms of politics? It is a unique platform for consultation among allies on matters that concern the national security of those allies. It is a permanent platform for transatlantic consultations, including the United States and Canada and the European allies. But then there's the, I think, one of the famous articles of Washington Treaty, Article 4, which is about consultations among those allies. And this article reads, and I will just quote it from my notes, that the parties will consult together whenever, in the opinion of any of them, the territorial integrity, political independence, or security of any of the parties is threatened. So, and this article, unfortunately, or let me put it this way, this article was rarely invoked during the Cold War period. But as crisis intensified and took different shapes in the post-Cold War period and post-Cold War period, the Article 4 was increasingly invoked in a more frequent manner. Just to give you, you all know that just on the 24th of February, upon the request of Poland, the allies met at NATO under Article 4. And this was the second time Poland invoked Article 4. They did so in a similar manner, and rightly so, after the illegal and illegitimate annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014. But also Turkey in the past 5 times invoked Article 4 of NATO for different purposes. So NATO is a platform for consultations, but apart from this, NATO, in a very unique matter, tries to harmonize the military capabilities of its allies through a unique defense planning system. It tries to increase interoperability among allies, and its deterrent function is based on conventional capabilities, ballistic missile defense capabilities, mainly provided by the US on a voluntary basis, and of course the individual ballistic missile defense capabilities of several allies, and nuclear capabilities. So there's a 3-pronged approach to NATO's deterrence. In the post-Cold War period, after the demise of the Soviet Union, NATO, somewhat experts thought that NATO lost its purpose. But many of you may recall that at that time, in 90s, several crises erupted. Or let me put it this way, after the demise of the Soviet Union, allies in Europe started to talk about peace dividends. That is, a major adversary at that time had disappeared. And we would be able to make more use of our non-military capabilities and resources in more beneficial ways to our societies, perhaps, at that time. But in a very unexpected way, several crises started to erupt in Caucasus, in the Balkans, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and then Kosovo. And NATO started or launched those operations upon the request of allies and mainly United States, first in the Balkans. These were, at that time, Balkans were considered an out-of-area place for the alliance. But then came, in 2001, 9/11 attacks on the United States. And fight against terror and counterterrorism came to the agenda of NATO, entered NATO's agenda, and ranked very high in NATO's agenda at that time. And NATO, from being a force based on heavy metal, on tanks, artillery, heavy weaponry, wanted to become more deployable, lighter, in order to carry out operations in places out of SACEUR's area of responsibility, out of the territory of the alliance. So this was a game-changing period for NATO, and this was the time when NATO started its or undertook ISAF operation in Afghanistan in 2003. It was the time when it entered into Iraq to carry out a training mission in Iraq. And this went on for some time. But then there was another game-changing or defining moment. And this was the illegal annexation of Crimea by Russia. This came as a wake-up call for allies. And it reminded once again, for many allies, the importance of collective defense. Right now, NATO has three core essential tasks. The first one is collective defense. The second one is crisis management. And the third one is cooperative security, about partnerships. This is, those core tasks are contained in NATO's strategic concept from 2010. But the focus was somewhat in early 2000s, in the first early decade of the 2000s, was rather on crisis management. But the developments in Crimea reminded everyone the importance of collective defense. And it became somewhat a primus inter pares of tasks among NATO, but the alliance is expected to carry out its three core essential tasks in the best manner possible. So let me touch upon partnerships a little bit. And partnerships, as I said, is now covered by cooperative security dimension. In the post-Cold War period, of course, with the demise and the breakup of the Soviet Union, a number of states came into being in early 90s. And at that time, NATO created the Partnership for Peace program, which sought to brought those states, including Russia, closer to the Euro-Atlantic area in terms of principles, in terms of operating procedures, in terms of a joint working culture. So PFP was created, and if I'm not wrong, at that time, 20 members from the former Soviet Union and Russia joined in the PFP program. And so that is the partnership dimension. Of course, PFP at that time was seen as a stepping stone for those members who wanted to, or who sought to become members of the allies. A path was envisaged. This path was starting with entering into the partnership program, and then one step ahead was envisaged as membership action plan, where more concrete goals were shared with partners.
Sure. Yeah, let me just interrupt very quickly, because I think this is extremely important information. And if we could focus specifically in these partnership programs on the relationship of Russia, because I think many who are not familiar may have the impression that Russia was excluded from NATO, was not part of NATO. But my understanding is that Russia was also part of the Partnership for Peace, and also Ukraine. So if you could explain specifically the relationships of Russia and even Ukraine with NATO.
Yes, certainly. As you said, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russia and Ukraine joined the Partnership for Peace program. And in 1997, NATO and Russia signed the NATO-Russia Founding Act. This NATO-Russia Founding Act was a step towards having better cooperation between Russia and NATO, it was intending to establish a platform for consultations between NATO and Russia as two equal partners at that time. With the NATO-Russia Founding Act, a permanent joint council was established. And the aim of this was to ensure exchange of information, discuss about interoperability, integration issues as necessary. In the same documents, NATO undertook not to deploy substantial combat forces in former Warsaw Pact member states. So this is a very important thing.
Yeah, this is important, yeah.
This is very important. And of course, there are different understandings from Russian authorities, or different claims from Russian authorities. They said that there were some certain promises were made. But of course, when we are listening to those arguments coming from the Russian side, saying that NATO in early 90s pledged not to expand towards Russia. At the same time, we need to recall that Russia undersigned several principles and commitments in various documents. You know,
in NATO.
Not NATO, in the context of Euro-Atlantic security architecture, foremost Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE context, the Helsinki Final Act, the Decalogue principles of the Helsinki Final Act is, I think, one of the most important documents in that regard. So with your permission, I will just refer briefly to those
please do, yeah,
understandings. And then I will try to focus on NATO-Russia relations. So the in the Helsinki Final Act, you know, at that time, this was signed in 1975 as part of a detente between NATO and the Soviet Union at that time. And then this led to the establishment of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. So sovereign equality, respect for the rights and sovereignty were mutually pledged between the signatories from the Euro-Atlantic area and Warsaw Pact members, refraining from threat of use of force, inviolability of frontiers, which are all very pertinent with the current war underway in Ukraine, and why this is a violation, gross violation of the international, the rules-based international order. Territorial integrity of states were mutually pledged. Peaceful settlement of the disputes was pledged. And this was then at a time when Soviet Union was breaking up, all of those principles were reaffirmed or carried forward and reaffirmed, this time under the 1990 Paris Charter, again signed under the OSCE or then CSCE arrangements, Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. In 1994, the CSCE became an organization. It became Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. But this time, the OSCE signed a very important document. And the OSCE, of course, has 57 members. So it is the most comprehensive pan-European organization.
Including Russia.
Including Russia, of course, and including US and all countries, or almost all countries in between. So and again, I took some notes since it's relevant. So the paragraph 8 of the Istanbul document very specifically says that each participating state has an equal right to security. We reaffirm the inherent right of each and every participating state to be free to choose or change its security arrangements, including treaties of alliance, as they evolve. So the point I'm trying to make here is that, you know, whereas the Russian authorities talk about some oral promises made or some oral commitments made, at the same time, they also undersigned those documents, and documents are a part of international law and a rules-based international order. So, of course, everyone is entitled to their judgments, and that's I would fully respect this. But we need to make this judgment not only based on one discourse, this discourse or that discourse, but on a sound basis, taking into account the views of all sides. So this is a fact.
Yeah. Ambassador, I just want to underline, because I think the point you made is something we've not heard that much, and it's so critical, that the Russian Federation in 1994 or afterwards, under the Istanbul document, basically agreed that a country like Ukraine could choose its own security arrangement. Is that correct?
Yes.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
I mean, Ukrainians, if I'm not wrong, they're also a party.
Yeah, they are. Yeah,
so,
OSCE, yeah.
So, you know, this document is here. And at the same time, coming back to the relation between NATO and Russia, in '97, the NATO-Russia Founding Act established this permanent joint council on an equal footing between NATO members and Russia. And again, as I said, it also included a very substantial, or several substantial pledges, one being not to permanently deploy substantial combat forces on the territory of former Warsaw Pact members.
I apologize, I'm going to interrupt, because it's so important. Please. What you're saying. When you say equal standing, could you explain that?
So, I mean, this became more clear in 2002 when the Rome Declaration was signed between NATO and Russia. So, when NATO-Russia Council, I mean, in simple terms, NATO has 30 members. With NATO-Russia Council, Russia is also added to this. So when this council convenes, it acts as if there are 31 members sitting there. When it takes decisions, it behaves as such. So that's what I mean by equal footing. It's not like NATO against Russia, but this cooperative platform includes, in effect, 31 members. So that's what I mean by equal footing.
So NATO was never going to be against Russia. It wasn't like the Soviet Union, in the sense that the NATO, the original NATO, was against the Soviet Union. That's not the modern NATO at that time.
Yeah, of course. During Cold War, there was this in the description of a, I think, former US diplomat. At that time, wherever the US was trying to put an X, the Soviet Union was trying to put an O. So there was such kind of a zero-sum understanding. But in early 90s, I think what the United States and NATO allies tried to do was to leave behind that negative history and try to do something, try to engage in something cooperative and positive. That was the spirit in early 90s. And one important clause, again contained in the NATO-Russia Founding Act is what is known as 3 no's. And 3 no's, NATO also pledged that it has no intention, no plan, and no reason to deploy nuclear capabilities on the territory of new members, by which, of course, at that time it was NATO was getting prepared to accept Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic as members, which they became members in 1999. But those pledges were in place at that time. So I find them important. And another step in the cooperative environment between NATO and Russia came in 2002 with the conclusion of the Rome Declaration and Rome Summit, where Mr. Putin at that time participated as the head of state of Russia. There, I also checked it. I mean, the cooperation is there, but Mr. Putin in the summit takes a more cautious tone in a diplomatic, in a guarded way. He kind of warns that we should not encroach our territories, but that was not the understanding at NATO, of course, at that time, based on, again, those documents. So there is this overall cooperative atmosphere, but then then there are some important milestones. In 2005, Mr. Putin calls the breakup of the Soviet Union as the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. And then in 2007, he makes this speech at the Munich Security Conference, and he reminds those oral pledges or oral promises and asks why NATO or the West reneged on them at that time. And then 2008, the Bucharest summit became, I think, a sort of breaking point when NATO said that Ukraine and Georgia will become members. This was, of course, contingent approach. No specific time was set. So the door is open, but when those countries will reach that door remains open and dependent on the developments. And I also recall that in 2000s, because unlike early 90s, where there was a cooperative atmosphere, I think in early 2000s, the Russian authorities started to have some concerns, because I'm saying this with a grain of salt, but what I'm trying to say is, first let me recall Kierkegaard, who says that life is lived forwards but understood backwards. And
very true.
Here, living history forwards, but then trying to understand it backwards. And in a personal capacity, I should say that so these Russians have an institutional memory from, I'm not trying to justify it or something like that, but as each state, they have their own records and they have their own institutional memory. And in 2000s, they saw some things, because in their minds, they wanted to keep a certain balance. They wanted to maintain a balance with the West. with United States, but there were some developments, I think, and which made them uneasy, such as the acceleration of the US ballistic missile defense program, which is very legitimate. I have no intention to question its validity or call into question its validity, but as this program accelerated, the Russian authorities, I also recall it somehow from my NATO days in 2005, 6, 7, they started asking the question, why, against whom? There were solid answers. There was a eagerness to cooperate under NATO umbrella together with Russia on the missile defense program. But even though everyone tried very hard, including and in particular the United States, the Russians didn't want to believe. Another development at that time was the withdrawal of United States from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, ABM treaty of 1972, if I'm not wrong. So they withdrew from this treaty, I think, in early 2000s again. So this was again a question. This came as a question mark in their minds. But of course, nothing. In spite of those developments,
during Trump.
Yeah, not in early 2000s. Yes, this unraveling of the rules-based system and the security architecture in the Euro-Atlantic area, unfortunately, accelerated after 2014 withdrawal from the INF treaty. The open skies.
I'm going to. I don't mean to interrupt you, but you said 2014, please. And that is a critical date because of the annexation of Crimea. And I think you've really laid out very well how the relationship between NATO and Russia evolved negatively from the 90s into the 2014. What happened in 2014, and really I think was trying to understand, because NATO has been criticized being somewhat ineffective, I think, particularly after the annexation. So what happened with NATO and Russian relationships, and the measures NATO did take or didn't take after this, and looking from today's, as you said, living history forward, but looking backwards.
So what happens, or Crimea? I think that we should first, I think, look at Georgia in 2008, and there Russia intervened in Georgia. We had the war in Georgia at the time, and now we have two breakaway regions recognized by Russia: South Ossetia and Abkhazia. I think this was a forerunner of what happened in Crimea. In Crimea, Russia, again, due to its instincts, state instincts, and it considers Crimea as a vital place and also strategic place because Black Sea, Crimea is a very important region for Russia, has always been. So they decided through some hybrid warfare tactics at that time, they decided to annex Crimea. Why NATO didn't do anything? Simply because NATO is about safeguarding, as I said at the outset, the security and independence of its allies. NATO took some measures, of course, but those measures were really aimed at assuring, first and foremost, allies that they would be covered by the alliance in case of any aggression or any incident. So the first, I think, act of NATO in the aftermath of the 2014 developments and the illegal annexation was to adopt rapid action plan. This is called in famous NATO acronyms RAP, was approved by heads of state and government in 2014 Wales summit. So basically, with that, NATO started some assurance measures. AWACS flights over Baltics and Poland, also over Romania, Bulgaria in the Black Sea. It established a rapid reaction force, which is called Very High Readiness Joint Task Force. It's a kind of vanguard military formation, the size of a brigade, more or less 5,000 personnel, but it is a joint and combined establishment. So it includes several nations or allies. It is led by allies in turn every year. Turkey was the lead nation for VJTF last year. And also it includes land, air, and maritime components. So this was one of the measures again. But then because of the ongoing nature of the confrontation or of the perception of threats, in 2016, if I'm not wrong at the time, NATO took a further step and established enhanced forward presence. It's established also at the Wales summit in 2014, enhanced forward presence, which is the deployment of battalion size formations on the territories of Baltic states and Poland. I need to underline at this point that these battalion size formations, and NATO was careful with that, does not constitute a violation of the NATO-Russia Founding Act, in which NATO pledged not to deploy permanently substantial forces. So battalion size formations are below substantial forces. And then in 2016, NATO this time initiated tailored forward presence in the Black Sea area to better assure Bulgaria and Romania. And also there are some measures for Turkey, also in view of the terrorism threats that we are faced with.
One thing I just want to clarify too is that, of course, Ukraine was not and still is not a member of NATO. Yes. So NATO had no obligation to protect Ukraine.
Exactly.
So these battalions were preventive in case of attack against the NATO members. Why were they there?
Those were defensive in nature, and they are aimed at assuring the allies and also deterring any threat.
Can I just go on this because going to Ukraine now, after the annexation of Crimea, well, just quickly, Georgia became a candidate, official candidate for NATO, I assume after 2008. Ukraine, despite everything that Russia's been saying, is not a candidate, official candidate. And why after 2014 didn't NATO actually accelerate Ukraine's membership?
Now, there are with the membership of North Macedonia. Now there are two aspirant countries. One is Bosnia-Herzegovina and the other is Georgia. Let me speak a little bit about the relationship between NATO and Ukraine. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, of course, one of the big questions was the future of nuclear weapons on the territory of the Soviet Union. And at that time, it was agreed between United States and Russia that the only nuclear state succeeding the Soviet Union would be Russia. So we witnessed a dismantling of nuclear weapons in other countries, including Ukraine. And one of the important agreements in that context, by the way, is the Budapest Memorandum, signed in '94. And again, in the Budapest Memorandum, this time United States, United Kingdom, and Russia commit to the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and that they would respect the independence of Ukraine. So this is again a part of the rules-based international system. But against this backdrop, Ukraine is one of the sizable countries in the middle of the Euro-Atlantic area. So in 1997, NATO established a distinctive partnership with Ukraine. At that time, as I said, again in '97, there was a distinctive cooperation between Russia and NATO, and Ukraine was also afforded a similar structure, and a NATO-Ukraine Commission was established. Ukraine was already a PFP country since 1994, and at the Madrid summit, this distinctive partnership with NATO was agreed, and NATO and Ukraine, in order to consult and cooperate, established this NATO-Ukraine Commission. And NATO has one more such cooperative or distinctive cooperative forum, and this is with Georgia, NATO-Georgia Commission. Of course, there are internal dynamics of the countries in play.
Sure.
I need to clarify that it takes two to tango when it comes to NATO's enlargement. It's like a marriage. Not only we don't have to want it, but our would-be lover or spouse should also say yes. And everyone makes its own calculation. And I should clarify that all decisions at NATO is taken on the basis of consensus.
Consensus, okay.
So everyone has to give their affirmative vote. And this is not changeable. And this is a very fundamental principle in NATO. So in 2008, at that time, the Ukrainian authorities sent a letter to NATO clarifying that they were eager to become a member of NATO. It was in early 2008. And on that basis, at the Budapest summit of NATO, at the Bucharest summit of NATO, sorry, in Romania, NATO stated that Georgia and Ukraine would become members of NATO without specifying a timeline or a roadmap. But they also clarified that membership action plan is the next step for Ukraine and Georgia on their way to membership. which means that, okay, those countries would become one-day members, but they need to fulfill certain criteria and pass certain thresholds, and MAP is one of them, or the major one. Since then, there were internal dynamics in those countries, an important one being the crisis in Georgia took place, of course, in August 2008. There was a tumultuous period. There were changes in leadership in Ukraine. And of course, due to their legitimate political considerations, some allies did not want to give a wrong political signal to Russia, because Russia, after all, is and it is valid today as well, Russia is a very important actor, and we are not, I mean Turkey, but in all countries, cooperate with Russia on different subjects, be it climate change,
or energy, natural gas, oil.
In different geographies. It is an established actor. So yeah. At that time, there was a reluctance to alienate Russia further. There was allies were trying to avoid, to instill a feeling that Russia was trying to be cornered. So this consensus.
Apparently, Russia didn't get that message, though.
Yes, but this does not necessarily mean that the allies were wrong. But I mean, these are political considerations at the end of the day, and in time they change, and we just look at them and then make our own interpretations and judgments. But so the MAP status was not granted either to Georgia or to Ukraine, but especially with the beginning of Crimea chapter, or post-Crimea, in a post-Crimea period, there was a significant willingness on the part of the allies, including Turkey, to bring those two countries closer to the alliance. What's it? For example, they are in NATO. There are regional partnership formats. So PFP is one of them. It looks at the Euro-Atlantic or members in the countries in the Euro-Atlantic. But there's also Mediterranean dialogue, Istanbul Cooperation Initiative.
But these are all very soft. I mean, none of them would guarantee Ukraine's defense.
No.
Article 5 wouldn't be triggered.
They don't include any guarantees, but they're also then thematic partnerships. So what I'm trying to say is thematic partnerships is basically on interoperability, and both Ukraine and Georgia was recognized as some special interoperability partners making significant contributions to the alliance's missions and operations. So, for example, in 2020, Ukraine was granted the status of enhanced opportunities partner. But as you said, Professor, the partnership status does not grant you Article 5 privileges, or does not bring you under Article 5 umbrella. This is this applies uniformly to all partners, and at the end of the day, it is a joint decision, or it's a decision for NATO and the interested partners to get closer.
So if I can, from what I'm understanding, and just trying to understand the situation we're in right now, based on what you've said, and very informative, I have to say, the relationship between NATO and Ukraine, even after Crimea annexation, there was no message that Ukraine was about to become a member of NATO.
No, I mean, there was no specific timeline. And, partnership with all partners in a way increases, because partnership, as I said, I mean, it's one of the core functions of NATO. So NATO tries to benefit from partners' experiences,
Right.
and likewise, we are trying to do so. It is not a stagnant thing, but it moves forward. But this doesn't mean that those partners would become
But it's a
allies
political, it's political, because
Yeah.
you said earlier, and I think NATO is a political military. So this is
Yes.
a political, but in terms of military, because I mean, Russia is justifying its actions on some security threat because of Ukraine's, going to join NATO. So far, what I've heard, we just don't, that is not really factually the case.
Yes, that's not the case. Yeah.
So I'm going to move us a little, I can't believe the time is going, and I feel like we're just scratching the surface, and I've learned a lot. But very quickly, what tools does NATO have now? And we have a number of questions, and I know this is an issue concerning Black Sea security, the Montreux Convention. And we know that the Montreux Convention was very recently in the news in terms of Turkey, whether to invoke Article 19 of the convention to stop the Russian vessels as belligerent vessels. So what tools does NATO have in the Montreux Convention? And then we're going to open it up to some questions.
Montreux Convention, we regard in Turkey Montreux Convention as the linchpin of stability and stability in the Black Sea Basin. It's now 86 years old, and Turkey, you know it better than I do.
No.
That Turkey implements Montreux Convention in a very diligent and impartial way. Looking at the situation underway to our north, the war in Ukraine, the decision is to invoke Article 19 of the Montreux Convention, which grants Turkey the right to close the Turkish straits to the passage of warships.
Belligerent.
So, belligerent of the belligerent side. So, this is very consistent with the line we've been following in the past 86 years. And we need to implement this agreement, both in its letter and its spirit, even in the most difficult moments for us. And I mean by that 2015, when a Russian aircraft was shut down, we implemented this in a very diligent way, without bending the agreement. So that's what we are doing right now.
Yes, I know it was for Turkey. I mean, the bit of the research I have done on this, because it really seems that not till maybe World War II has Article 19 been an issue.
I tried to check that, but I couldn't find any records on that.
Yeah, that's all I could find, is that it was applied in World War II. So, which shows you the gravity of the situation. And I know there was some interest on that and on Montreux, but I think that it is, I agree with you, the Montreux Convention has always been absolutely the linchpin to Black Sea security over 86 years, absolutely. And Turkey has had to go through some really tough times, the Cold War, and I think I like to remind people that Turkey was the only NATO power on the Black Sea facing, this major nuclear power, USSR. Of course, NATO was its great protection. So, yeah. And just again, going back to, so NATO now, here we are. NATO, I know they've invoked the consultation. At this point, what do they take Ukraine in? I mean, what can NATO do at this point?
What can NATO do? Basically, NATO is now trying to step up its deterrent function. Again, trying to make sure and assure the allies that any encroachment, any violation of their territorial integrity would be defended. So it's taking measures. But this is all those measures, all those deployments, and we're reading the new deployments or listening to them, looking at them, committed by allies, the reinforcement of Baltic allies in the Baltics, Poland, Romania, and the others, is limited to NATO territory. Again, any decision beyond that, and also in NATO, requires a consensus. But as what can NATO do beyond that? Actually, individual allies extend their help to Ukraine. And by the way, I must say that even if we think for a moment, even if Article 5 was invoked, there is no automaticity about it. So for invocation of Article 5, we need a consensus in NATO of 30 allies. And then there is no uniform way of assisting or contributing to Article 5 situation. Every ally assists the ally that came under attack as they seem appropriate, as they deem appropriate. Therefore, those are the limitations and the safeguards of the Article 5. It was invoked only once, in 2001, and NATO started 2 operations with that one, Eagle Assist, to display solidarity with the United States by deploying AWACS aircraft at the time to United States, or sending AWACS aircraft. And the second was the active Endeavour operation in the Mediterranean against terrorism and WMD trafficking. So what NATO can do with regard to Ukraine has its own limitations, limited to the alliance territory, and we need to be very cautious here, not to trigger a spillover of the war further. The situation is very dangerous, with the now nuclear alert levels also in play. And therefore, I think caution and to act cautiously is the most important thing. And then in the international community has rallied around Ukraine to extend their support to Ukraine in appropriate ways. But I must also underline that this endeavor is not necessarily anti-Russian or pro-Ukraine, or in some tweets I'm seeing this. It is not about Christianity, or it's not against East against West, or vice versa, because this is a very universal thing. The rules-based international order now, thanks to our globalized world, in a very positive sense, I say this, is something everything should defend. And we are seeing how countries, not only in the Euro-Atlantic area, but in this part of the world, including Singapore, Japan, and others, are stepping up and trying to demonstrate a principled stance. And that's why we need to continue in a very cool-headed manner. Because after all, I'm not a politician, but I'm a practitioner. And as a practitioner, I can just say that even though what NATO can do regarding this is limited, there are ways in which we can help this war stop. There are ways in which we can support or encourage a political resolution. Of course, it's up to Ukraine must be in the forefront in this regard, and they are. And many countries, including Turkey, including Azerbaijan and others, are eager and willing to bring Russia and Ukraine to the political table for negotiations and solution. Again, I mean, this is where we are.
No, thank you, Ambassador. I have to say that NATO is an area that many people may not necessarily be particularly well versed in. And I think you've really given us in depth, and I know we didn't have a lot of time to do that. We could go on much longer, but really understanding NATO and how it's evolved since the breakup of the former Soviet Union. And really important, that relationship with Russia, because I think many people, in fact, we have one question, why can't Russia be a member of NATO? I think the question is, NATO didn't pose itself as an enemy of Russia. You had a partnership agreement. You had all kinds of political engagements. You talked about the Istanbul documents. All these commitments were made. So I don't want to say fake information, but I think it's so important for people to be properly informed and understanding the reality of what is happening. And I really feel that your explanation today has helped enormously, and also the limitations. What can NATO do? It's really the UN, the United Nations system. That is where the heart of the rules-based multilateral system lies. And of course, we know with the Security Council, Russia is, one of the P5, and it can veto itself. And ironically, it's now the president of the council as well. But nonetheless, what I understand from you is that, we shouldn't be looking to military options, but using every possible political, diplomatic option we can to bring, right now, supposedly they're at the table, but it's not real, but really to bring a ceasefire and have some negotiations. The question then, and I'm going to make one last question, actually. The question then is, Russia is putting this condition of a guarantee that Ukraine will not be a member. And I know there's a commitment that there's a freedom to secure your whatever alliance you want. Is that just not a no-go? Or is this just an excuse to be able to commit this act of aggression to get back its former Soviet glory? Ukraine, as you said, Odessa, the Black Sea, I won't go on and on, but there's more. It's a very emotional, historical relationship.
Now, of course, while Russia says that Ukraine should not become a NATO member, and kind of sees this as the grounds for for waging war on Ukraine, it's in very clear ways committed that Ukraine can make its own sovereign choices. I wouldn't say that it's a I would be hesitant to say that Russians are using this as a pretext or trying to return back to their own glory. Because I'm now seeing nowadays a lot of mind reading exercises and psycho analysis, and I don't want to enter into that. But looking back in history, the Russians have their institutional memory. This is not necessarily correct and not factual. Could we have engaged them in more comprehensive ways? I mean, this is a question so that, you know, we wouldn't have this friction perhaps today. This is a question that could be really answered by historians. But we cannot just take that discourse for granted, because there are a number of documents which the Russian side also undersigned. And I think that that's a no-go. That's something, first and foremost, Ukrainians themselves have to decide, not us,
True.
Not the Russians.
True.
And so let me leave it there. But looking forward, yes, the situation is very grim. We are quite pessimistic. But looking at the bright side, I think there is now an increased awareness about the importance of rules-based international order, about the importance of international law. Now, more countries than ever are worried about the unraveling of the international rules-based international system. And as I think Singaporean, the permanent representative of Singapore also said at the extraordinary meeting of the General Assembly, the United Nations Security Council was unable to discharge its primary responsibilities. So we have been calling for a reform and overhaul of this international system as well, together with some others. So we need a more effective, functioning international system. And I think these developments, these unfortunate developments and the sufferings will trigger at least one positive thing. And I should also say that our thoughts are always with the people of Ukraine who are suffering. And our condolences also go to those who lost their lives. And we also wish a very speedy recovery to those who are wounded. I mean, this is, hopefully this should be over soon.
Yeah, I agree with you very much and agree with everything you said. I'm going to take one question here from a good colleague, Sharon Sea. And greetings to you. I'm so happy you joined us. Ambassador, and of course, as best as you can answer, which state do you think has influence over Russia and can change the course of events? And specifically looking, does China have a role to play in mediating this conflict? So I know you're a NATO expert, not necessarily a China expert, but maybe you have some thoughts on this.
So far, as far as I followed, China did not step up to mediate between Ukraine and Russia. But any contribution is welcome at this point in time. There are countries who are trying to help first and foremost to secure a ceasefire and then take this issue to the negotiation table so that there will be engagement. But yes, China is a close partner of Russia, but I would be reluctant to speculate, but if they want, of course, as far as I see, China has is a respected partner of Russia, and it can surely communicate with Russia.
Yeah, there may be actually an opportunity for China to show its diplomatic prowess, gain some, I would say, additional stature in the diplomatic world. I think it really does see itself as a mediator, and that's the message I sense, although I'm not an expert. I know I don't want to exhaust you too much, but I have one question here from a Turkish colleague, Ferhat Ercümen. Very interesting. It says the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs stated that they urged all states repairing to the Black Sea or not, belligerent or not, that their warships shouldn't pass through the Turkish Straits. Is Turkey implementing Article 21 of the Montreux Convention? And that, as you know, is that Turkey, in this case, has the discretion to close the straits entirely should it feel imminent threat. I didn't know, I myself have not known the statement made by the MFA, such a general statement, but perhaps, Ambassador, you have information on this?
I'm not aware of that statement either. I just listened to the statements of Minister Çavuşoğlu, and I mean, I'm aware of what our minister said about the situation in the Turkish Straits.
Yeah, that would surprise me. I don't think Turkey has ever done that, and this certainly, my understanding is more it's invoking Article 19.
19 rather than
19, and that basically treating a situation as a war, because it applies under the Montreux Convention in times of war. Turkey being a non-belligerent, we say neutral or whatever, non-belligerent, that the powers, the belligerent powers are not allowed access into the straits except to return to their bases.
Yes.
I won't go into some international law issues about, you know, Crimea, Sevastopol, whether it's a Russian base or not, but I think Turkey is implementing that now. It took that decision, and it seems to have been welcome by states, except Russia, I'm sure, but
I mean, I haven't seen any also, at least maybe my ignorance, but I haven't seen any negative statements from the Russian side as well. As far as I know also, after Turkey's decision, no Russian ships crossed the Turkish Straits, so there was no plan, I think, for Russian ships to cross the straits. But I think that decision again has political significance in the first place, and the most important issue in that regard is not to please any country, but to continue implementing Montreux Convention in accordance with its letter and spirit, just as we did in the course of the past 86 years. So I think that's the most important thing from Turkey's perspective, and that's what we are trying to do.
Yes, and I see Ferhat Bey has corrected. It was not the MFA, but President Erdogan. So it was a political statement, probably just urging, but that's not a decision made, and I think that would be a difficult one at this point to do that. I know we have questions. I think these probably go beyond your expertise about the possible role of India. India's abstained. I don't know if you have any thoughts. It's like China and India, but this is from my friend Sunil. Obviously, these are the big powers. Both China and India abstained from the Security Council vote. But there's an opportunity, but it's time. They really need to play the role that they can to bring a ceasefire to the situation. It's dire. I mean, they call it the worst threat since World War II, although I know that you mentioned, of course, the former Yugoslavia in the backyard of Europe, the actions that take it, but this is more grave, apparently, although NATO took action there. Yeah,
yeah, that was a time when Yugoslavia was breaking up, and there were, I mean, it was more a civil war rather than a full-fledged war between countries. And NATO forces were deployed in Bosnia-Herzegovina just to first preserve the peace established there. So it was not during the conflict period, if I'm not wrong. And then in the aftermath of the Dayton agreements as a peacekeeping force there. A second intervention came in 1999 to Kosovo, and this is the only operation in NATO's history, I think, which was carried out without a UN Security Council resolution. And I've heard many allies in the past who say that it's the only and the last one of that kind. So because the United Nations green light, Security Council's green light is important for legitimacy of NATO's operations. But the situation, the war in Ukraine, what we are having is, I think, graver, more serious, and I've seen parallels with 1938, 1939, 1956, 1968. So there are those parallels. Of course, you know, there are similarities. Just as Mark Twain said again. I liked those references. So history does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. And
you're good, very good, very good. Yeah.
In concerning, in varying ways. But I think one of the things I should also emphasize is to whatever happens, it is important to keep those dialogue channels open, engagement channels open. I think this is one of the most important things. And sometimes countries, for their own legitimate reasons, may abstain. I wouldn't jump to conclusions about that. Also because Turkey, I've seen many people jumping to conclusions in the past about Turkey's actions, which are legitimate from our perspective. But for example, at the Council of Europe, Turkey also abstained in the decision to expel Russia from Council of Europe. The basic reason for that is, again, as I said, we are not trying to be pro-Ukraine, anti-Russian or something like that, but we are trying to uphold continue a principled stance, uphold rules-based international order. But at the same time, I think it's important, as our minister emphasized, to keep dialogue channels open. And that's why Turkey acted in that way at the Council of Europe, to keep those engagements open.
Okay. That's, yeah. And in fact, I think the foreign minister of Singapore said, we don't take sides, we uphold principles. Yes. And that is important. And thank you. I think we're very quick to be judgmental. And it is important to have lines of communication open, because otherwise, as they say, the end of diplomacy is war. And what could be worse? I mean, right now it is a very dire situation. I agree, you know, our thoughts and prayers and hearts go to, you know, the innocent Ukrainians. On the other hand, it is so dangerous right now. I mean, yes. President Putin, for whatever reason, has pulled the nuclear, you know, that, I don't say pushed it, but certainly threatened it. So the world does have to act with great caution. And I will just repeat something you said. This is a very grave period. On the other hand, perhaps it has refocus attention on, for me, important international law. When I was listening to the statements in the extraordinary meeting of the General Assembly, international law echoed throughout that meeting, which was very warming to my heart, but also appreciating the importance of this multilateral rule-based system, the UN Charter, and really working to find a solution. We'll see, you know, but Ambassador, I'm not going to, we've taken up so much of your time, but I just want to say how enlightening and educating this has been. I have learned a lot, and I know from comments, our audience as well, to understand the complexity, not just of NATO, but again, this relationship between NATO, Ukraine, NATO, Russia, that is overarching, it's coloring this whole crisis. And I think we've learned a lot through you. And I know we could go on some more, and I hope we can have you back to talk, you know, more. Perhaps we could have a session on the Montreux Convention, lots of questions on that. But on behalf of CIL, I thank you immensely for taking the time to be with us. It was really a privilege for us, and really, truly a very informative session. Teşekkür ederim Sayın Büyükelçim.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor. Ben teşekkür ederim. It's especially important, and it's an honor to hear those words from you. I mean, I would be most pleased if I could, if I contributed. This was the kind of, I was also trying to gather my thoughts, and it was also very useful for me. Just let me finish with this. A couple of years ago, when the threat of terrorism beyond the southern territories of Turkey was high, we were saying that what happened in the south does not stay in the south. So that, you know, everyone should be aware of this, and everyone should take the necessary measures, in particular our allies. And I think now we can also say that what happens in Ukraine will not stay in Ukraine. So that's why the situation is dangerous. And again, there's a risk, but hopefully I think this will be a stage for better and new developments. But again, I should conclude by saying that our hearts and minds are with innocent Ukrainians who are suffering in this war.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ambassador, and thanks to everyone who has joined us. And stay tuned. CIL will be back with continued webinars, panels, meeting with such distinguished persons and experts such as the Ambassador. Take care, everyone. Stay safe. And we pray for peace. We pray for peace. We really do.
Bye-bye.